It's every parent's worst nightmare, thinking that there might be something wrong with your child. They're not meeting their milestones in the same way as other children, and they seem to get really upset over the smallest thing. You can't always find a way to get through to them, and you're terrified. What's this going to mean for the rest of their lives? I've seen this scenario play out so many times in my work as a speech-language pathologist, when parents suspect that their children might be neurodiverse. As a neurodiverse person myself, I want to flip the script on these outdated narratives about neurodiversity. During this talk, I want you to come on a journey with me to open your mind to the possibility of embracing the diversity of all of our brains and to question everything you've ever heard about neurodiversity. If I could remove just one thing from neurodiverse conditions, such as autism spectrum disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, it would be just that last word, disorder. Because neurodiverse brains are not disordered, they're simply wired differently. I've developed a model to conceptualise the neurodiverse brain. As you will see, there are many features of neurodiversity, and this model just shows a few. Each of these features exists on a spectrum. So, for example, one common feature of neurodiversity is having sensory needs. Some people are sensory seeking, meaning they're always looking for input in their body to regulate their nervous system. They might move around a lot, they might like really tight hugs, and they might like looking at bright lights. Other people are sensory avoidant, so they're on the other end of the spectrum. They might be putting their hands over their ears when they hear a loud noise. They might walk on their tippy toes because they don't like the feeling of input on their feet. They can be quite particular about the types of clothes that they wear, and they can be really fussy when it comes to eating certain textures or flavours. Another feature of neurodiversity is verbal expression. Some people are non-speaking, whereas others are hyperverbal, and they'll talk from sun up till sundown, particularly about their topics of interest. And others are just somewhere in between. Another commonly misunderstood feature of neurodiversity is empathy. Many people falsely believe that neurodiverse people do not experience empathy. But, like every other feature of neurodiversity, empathy exists on a spectrum. And so while some people do have difficulties with empathy, others have what we call hyper-empathy, and they can feel everything about another person's feelings or a social situation with such great intensity that it can almost be painful. If we were to map my brain onto this model, you'd see that I'm sensory avoidant. I don't really like bright lights, and I don't like the feeling of certain clothes, and perhaps the first sign of my neurodiversity was that I've always been a really fussy eater. You might have also guessed that I'm hyperverbal. Perhaps that's why I became a speech-language pathologist, because I love to talk. Because my brain's more on the ADHD side, I do find it really hard to maintain attention on things, unless it's something that I'm super interested in. And then I'm on the other end of the spectrum, where I can hyper-focus, forsaking every other human need like eating and drinking, until I've learned absolutely everything about a topic. I bet when you think about ADHD, what comes to mind is the hyperactive little boy bouncing off the walls with too much energy. But if we flipped back through my school reports, what they probably would say is Sarah is helpful, compliant, and smart. They probably also said that I talked too much and asked and answered too many questions. But that's because for me, like many other neurodiverse girls, the hyperactivity is not in my body, it's in my brain. I remember one specific report card that made my mum a bit upset that said, Sarah thinks she knows everything. Now, this one confused me a lot because I actually thought you were supposed to know everything. I thought the whole point of going to school was to listen to everything that the teacher said, learn everything, and then when they ask you a question, you answer it. So I couldn't figure out what I'd done wrong. But through this report card and lots of social observation, I learned that knowing everything, especially for a girl, is not socially desirable. And so this was my first lesson in masking. Masking is a feature of neurodiversity where people hide their true selves in order to fit in with social norms. And I became really good at masking. In fact, most people wouldn't even know I was neurodiverse unless I, say, made a TED talk about it. And so, even to this day, if I'm talking to someone and everything that they're saying is completely factually incorrect, I won't interrupt them, I won't correct them, I won't say anything, because that would be being a know-it-all. And being a know-it-all is socially undesirable. As you can see from the many different features of neurodiversity in this model, and it only shows a few, and the infinite combination of them within an individual's brain, no two neurodiverse people are the same. One helpful way that we can conceptualise this is to think about the human brain like a computer. Every computer has an operating system. The most commonly used operating system in the world is Microsoft Windows. And this is the type of computer that's used in most schools and university, and most people's first experience of working with computers comes through working with a Microsoft Windows computer. But there are other types of operating systems out there as well. For example, an Apple Mac. An Apple Mac is just as capable as a Microsoft Windows computer. In fact, some people would argue that it's far more competent in its capabilities. But no one would ever say that an Apple Mac was disordered simply because it requires different input, user knowledge and commands than a Microsoft Windows computer. And so, in the same way, we need neurodiverse brains and neurotypical brains as part of the human experience. Unfortunately, this strengths-based view of neurodiversity has not always been the greater narrative that has surrounded it. In fact, until 2013, what we now call level 1 autism was known as Asperger's syndrome. And the reason for this name change is that Hans Asperger, who was a foundational researcher in the field of autism, was actually a paediatrician during the Nazi regime who participated in the euthanasia of children with autism. Instead of seeing this as problematic, we named this group of people after him for decades. Much of the misinformation that we have about neurodiversity comes from the fact that the foundational researchers in this field were not neurodiverse themselves, and so they drew incorrect conclusions from their research. And these incorrect conclusions have persisted to this day and created myths that still exist. So, in this talk, there are two specific myths that I would like to bust about neurodiversity. The first is that neurodiversity is new and suddenly everywhere. And the second is that neurodiversity is a bad thing. So let's start with myth number 1, that neurodiversity is new. While it's true that conditions such as autism and ADHD are being diagnosed more frequently in recent decades, this doesn't mean that their actual presence in society has changed. It just means that our understanding of these conditions has increased and we know what to look for, and so more people can get diagnosed. I bet while I've been talking, you've been able to think about someone in your life who fits the profile of neurodiversity. And who knows, by the end of this talk, you might be questioning whether you yourself are neurodiverse too. Maybe we've all been around neurodiversity a lot longer than we think. It just never got diagnosed in previous generations. And that's because you don't actually need a diagnosis to be neurodiverse. You don't need a diagnosis to be French, if that's just who you are. And you don't need a diagnosis to be a male, if that's just who you are. So if we shift from thinking about neurodiversity as a disorder and towards it being a neurotype, you don't need a diagnosis to be neurodiverse. That's just who you are. Of course, people will still seek diagnoses because they need access to funding and support and medication, but a neurodiverse person has always been neurodiverse, both before and after their formal diagnosis. The second myth that I want to bust is that neurodiversity is a bad thing. With all of the negative stereotypes around autism and ADHD, it would be easy to think that finding out that your child is neurodiverse really is a parent's worst nightmare. And I've seen this many times in my clinic when families will come to me with a child who has the most clear-cut case of autism. And they'll say something like, "I think we just need to work on making his speech clearer." But what they're really saying is, please don't say the A word. Please don't tell us he's autistic. And what I want parents to know is that having a neurodiverse child is nothing to be afraid of. Of course, it's always going to be challenging to raise a child whose brain works completely differently to yours. And it requires infinite patience as you get to know each other and how your brains work. But if we can map children's brains onto this model of neurodiversity, we can start to understand how their individual brain works and set up their environment in a way that will help them to not only function, but also to thrive. The social model of health states that it is not people who are disabled, but rather a lack of accommodation by society that creates disability. And so, if we can create a society where everybody fits in, then we're going to have a society that is for all neurodiverse people. Because neurodiverse people's brains are wired differently, we often find hard things easy and easy things like getting out of bed and getting dressed really hard. So for me, one of the easiest things I've ever done is get my PhD. All you have to do is pick your favourite topic and do nothing but read, think and write about it for 3 years. On the other hand, the hardest thing I've ever done is get my kids ready in the morning. There are so many steps. Finding foods that they'll actually eat, brushing their teeth, putting on clothes that don't feel right, putting on sunscreen that doesn't smell right, hats, socks, shoes, permission slips. If even one thing goes wrong, the whole thing can fall apart. And I'm expected to do this every single day before 8:30 a.m. None of these structures are set up for the neurodiverse brain, and yet we still have to fit into them. Having ADHD means it's really hard to remember multiple things at once. And time blindness, which is another feature of neurodiversity, means it's really hard to know how long a task will take, which is why neurodiverse people are often running late and find daily routines really struggling, especially if our children are neurodiverse as well, which they often are. I still find it baffling that there's no one waiting for me with a trophy every time we finally make it through the front door. Despite all the challenges of being neurodiverse, there are also lots of great things about the neurodiverse brain. In fact, some scientists go as far as to say that neurodiverse traits may have been preserved through the human evolutionary process because they are so advantageous to our species. And that makes sense when you think about all of the wonderful things that have come about as a part of human civilization from neurodiverse people. For example, without neurodiversity, we would have never been to the moon, because many of the fine folks at NASA are neurodiverse. We wouldn't have the theory of evolution, the theory of relativity, or even electricity, because it's widely believed that the people who invented all of these things were autistic. We need diverse brains to come up with novel solutions to complex problems, and we need their pattern recognition and problem-solving skills to come up with inventions that can make the world a better place. But more importantly than all those big things, what we really need to do is to create space for neurodiverse people to just be themselves and to do things in their own way, because there is such beauty in difference. I dream of a world where everybody is given a chance to embrace the diversity of their brain and to flourish. I hope that one day a family will come into my clinic and I'll say to them, "Your child is autistic," and they'll say, "Great, what can we do to help?" And so, in conclusion, I ask you, is it the way that the neurodiverse brain thinks that is disordered? Or could it be society's thinking towards neurodiversity that is disordered? Thank you.